Did you know Ethiopia is a federal parliamentary republic governed by a 1995 constitution that organizes regions along linguistic and ethnic lines, influencing its multi-party politics for decades? Since 2018, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has implemented major political reforms, including lifting a ban on opposition groups, inviting exiled leaders to return, and dissolving the EPRDF to form the Prosperity Party, a national platform uniting ethnic-based blocs. In this episode of Ethiopia in Focus, I'll be speaking with Dr. Gedion Timothewos. Dr. Gedion is Ethiopia's current foreign minister, former Minister of Justice, and a Central Committee member of the ruling Prosperity Party. Our conversation will dwell on the political reforms undertaken and the inherited challenges the government continues to address. So today's Ethiopia in Focus conversation is with Dr. Gedion Timothewos on the topic of tackling political and social challenges through sustainable solutions. Dr. Gedion, welcome. So it's been the case that over the past few years, specifically over the past 6 years, we've undergone tremendous development economically and a lot of political reforms and changes. But despite the opening up of the political space, what we've also witnessed is instances of conflict and violence, particularly perpetuated through political contestations. And somehow this is an antithesis to 21st century political engagement or political civic engagement, which requires dialogue over armed extremism. So maybe just to give background and context to some of these political violence and conflicts, we can get to the root of it. What are the root causes of some of these instances?
Thank you very much. So to understand where we are right now and the challenge we face, the conflicts that have occurred, it is very important to look at certain factors, including our history, our political culture, our demographic reality, and also the economic situation that we find ourselves in. So to start with our history, the process through which the Ethiopian state is formed is rather unique in the African continent. In most parts of the world, states are formed through conflict, through violence, through blood and steel. That doesn't make Ethiopia unique, but what makes Ethiopia unique, particularly in the African context, is the fact that the state formation was led by indigenous native forces. The main protagonists in this process are Ethiopian. But if you look at the history of most African countries, the state formation was it was an outcome of colonial conquest and the involvement of European actors is quite significant. So we have a state formation process that was led by local political forces, and we didn't have an opportunity to strengthen or to cement that state formation process through a social contract. And we didn't have an opportunity to heal the wounds and contradictions that have arisen out of the state formation process. So the legitimacy of the state was questioned and contested by some. So we have that background to grapple with.
This contestation has been occurring throughout the formation of the state.
Yeah, and it has been exacerbated by subsequent events. So there were some who are challenging the very legitimacy of the state that has come into existence, the modern Ethiopian state. Some have contested and challenged its nature, its vision, its identity, the narratives. Some have found it difficult to accept the institutions and its configurations. So there has always been this basic contradiction that has arisen out of the state formation process, and we have not squarely dealt with it in a manner that would engender consensus among critical actors. Another layer that we have to look into is the fact that we have a very violent and autocratic political culture. So whenever there are either be it contestation for power or political differences about policy, about institutional arrangement, more often than not, the instrument of solving these differences has been conflict. So imposing your will, your vision on everybody else through violence, through the use of force, has been how we have done business for generations. And once you have secured power, once you have assumed the highest office, using autocratic means to consolidate power, that has been our practice. And through this process, not just through the state formation process, but through this autocratic and violent exercise of power, there have been many wounds and grievances and violations. And we have not also been able to address those in a way that is satisfactory to most Ethiopians. So we have this contradiction, we have this background. And on top of this, in an attempt to resolve some of these problems, the solutions and prescriptions that have been introduced, at times they have been very divisive. They have emphasized differences, divisions at the expense of what unites us, what binds us. So our politics has increasingly become polarized and ethnicized. And that is also something to take into account.
But let's fast forward a little bit to 2018, because 2018 saw a turning point in terms of this culture, this violent political culture that you mentioned, which is we saw a peaceful transition of power, unlike any time that we've seen in our modern history. Nevertheless, these violent political contestations have also continued, and we are seeing the manifestations of these inherited challenges that you said. Elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, yes, there was a peaceful transfer of power in 2018, but that event, that episode, couldn't, in and of itself, overcome centuries and generations worth of history and entrenched political culture, right? So when that transfer of power occurred and when a new political dispensation was introduced, there are those who are very unhappy about that, who didn't accept the new dispensation, who thought...
Change in the status quo?
Yeah, who thought they could reverse this change, who wanted to return to the status quo. There are also those who wanted there to be change, but who wanted the change and transition to go in a particular direction. They had their own vision of what the change should look like. And for both sides, for both actors, instead of solving these differences through dialogue and political discourse, our default position, what drives us, the political culture that informs our behavior, is one that would privilege violence over dialogue. Most political actors do not have the patience, do not have the practice or the sensibility for that kind of engagement. Violence looks like a shortcut. It's what we are used to. Within the political class, there isn't this conviction or principle that violence is unacceptable to resolve political differences. So not everyone would say that, we have had this transition, let's build on it, let's consolidate it. The contradictions I have mentioned earlier, reinforced by that political culture, the inertia is against democratic, peaceful politics.
As some of the root causes, you've identified contested historical narratives. somehow perpetuated or ethnicized as well these historical narratives. You've also identified a political culture that is quite violent and has not updated itself with the times that we're in. And also political elites probably not having a common agenda to work towards, where a lot of the political elites in the past may have utilized differences instead of commonalities to bring the nation together as part of the state formation. What would you say is the role of overt and covert actors? Because some of the actors are overt, but then are there covert actors also at play in the current?
Sure. When you have this kind of internal divisions, polarization, there are those who want to exploit these divisions. Countries, actors that think that who are of the view that their national interest is best served by having a weak Ethiopia, a divided Ethiopia, an Ethiopian state that is not capable of delivering on certain objectives, on certain projects. They would naturally try to exploit these divisions, to fuel them using various means. Some of them covert, some of them quite overt. So our divisions have made us quite vulnerable for this kind of sinister actors.
Okay, circling back to the root causes and what's transpired post-2018, what I want us to get a little bit into is the political liberalization that has occurred post-2018. Particularly within the first year, what we witnessed is really an opening up of the political space. Political actors that were in the prior regime brandished as terrorist organizations were allowed to come back in. A lot of political parties that were inactive were provided the space to engage. And in fact, the Prime Minister on multiple occasions over the past 6 years has had a lot of sessions that has engaged various political actors and constituencies. Would you say, still with this manifestation of violent political contestations, that the political liberalization may have been taken for granted or hijacked by some actors?
I would say that we have not responsibly and properly utilized the space created by the political liberalization. Political liberalization has offered an opportunity, a platform for political actors, parties, civil society, media to engage on civic matters, on public affairs in relative freedom and liberty. But that space has also been utilized by violent, militant extremist groups to drive their agenda, to use the democratic space to advance anti-democratic objectives and to use anti-democratic tactics as well. And I would say...
In tandem with covert actors?
Sometimes they collude. There would be, tactically they would say that our interests are aligned. For the local actors, their objective might be some form of regime change, trying to challenge the government, trying to take over power. But for the external actors who are supporting them covertly, the objective is destabilizing the country, weakening the Ethiopian state, bringing about its dismemberment if possible. So there have been obvious collusions between these actors. And I would say that there have also been other countries, other societies in which initial liberalization has led to violent contestation, has contributed to the flourishing of extremist views and groups, because this is something that requires getting used to. We can't all become democrats overnight. You might change your laws, you might adopt new institutional arrangements, but developing the culture, the sensibility, the ethos for democratic discourse and politics, that takes time, that requires some form of democratic socialization. And, it's something that happens through generations and not overnight.
One of the things that I recall, particularly prior to 2018, and now because we're talking about democratization and liberalization of the political space and liberalization of expressions as well. And the internet has got a huge role in that sense. And what I recall prior to 2018 is I remember Ethiopia used to be one of the most expensive countries when it comes to accessing the internet. In Africa, it was probably one of the highest in terms of cost. But what we've seen through the liberalization of the digital space within Ethiopia is internet penetration has increased. Hence, a lot of people are now connected in various parts of the country as well, accessing or interacting with different segments of society within and across the world has become much easier as well. What I'm leading to is because you mentioned earlier in terms of this perpetuation for narration of a disintegration of a nation. And we see that at play a lot over social media. So I want us to get a little bit into your perspective on what is the role of social media, particularly in fueling violent conflicts and also perpetuating this narration of a disintegration of a nation.
I would say that social media and generally the digital media platforms have played a significant role in worsening polarization and division. The polarization was already there. Clashing narratives were already there. Certain degree of animosity, antagonistic posture, ethnic and religious extremism, it was already there. And to some extent, it was even state-sponsored and institutionalized. But the fact that everyone now has, pretty much everyone has
information at their fingertips.
Yeah, an opportunity to, the mechanism, the instruments to generate content and to propagate it, to disseminate it to millions, if not billions, without any editorial oversight, without any restraint. That has made it quite easy for anyone with an extremist view to infect millions. And the algorithm of these social media platforms, their business model itself, it promotes divisive content, because the more controversial and divisive it is, the more
popular that you get,
the more reaction it would trigger. The more reaction it triggers, the way they see it, it's an engaging content. We'll get more viewers, we'll get more people engaged, hooked to this platform, so they are promoted. If you say something that is conciliatory, something that is intended to bring everyone together, that is boring, that's not engaging, so it's relegated in the feed. So I would say that social media platforms have fueled the division and fueled extremism, and that has been exhibited not only in Ethiopia, but in countries that were supposedly established democracies. You have a situation now where in countries that boast a democracy of 200 years or for centuries,
see a surge in right-wing extremism as well.
Yeah, people
saying,
the election has been stolen. Our institutions are not fair. There is selective prosecution. So you see the legitimacy and credibility of institutions being eroded, even in established democracies, due to social media. And in a context like Ethiopia, where you don't have strong institutions, where you don't have a robust social contract, the negative effects of these media platforms is even more pronounced.
And many locally as well as internationally are becoming susceptible to conflict entrepreneurs. Digital conflict entrepreneurship, I would also say, is something that might be currently being perpetuated. Would that be something that you see being reflected here as well?
Yeah, I mean, for the digital space and the ease with which you could disseminate any view, it has made it easier for conflict entrepreneurs to engage in their trade, to sow division, to sow chaos, and try to gain some political or economic benefit through their crisis.
Okay. So, Dr. Gedion, let's get into a little bit of the most important part, which is what the government has been doing in addressing these instances of conflict and political violence. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, one thing among many things that he has been consistent about over the past 6 years is this call to, armed actors. Even when the political space at the beginning was opening up and many of the reforms were taking place, bringing armed actors to, come around the table and discuss the future of Ethiopia has been something that he has been championing from the beginning. Recently, on the 5th year anniversary of the formation of the Prosperity Party, he had also once again, put a call to armed actors to put their arms down and come back around the negotiating table or the discussion table. What has the government been doing consistently over the past few years in addressing these instances of political contestation, violent contestation, and conflicts?
I think in relation to this, there are initiatives and efforts that and the policy directions that we have to look into. Whenever violent actors, militant groups have tried to impose their will on the nation, on the people, one of the things that the government has tried to do is uphold law and order, demonstrate that this means this path doesn't lead anywhere, that it is unacceptable. So resisting these efforts, countering these efforts, taking law enforcement measures, containing this kind of militant campaigns, this has been something that has been done throughout the last 5 years.
But it also is tied to what you said prior, where we had weak institutions to enforce these kind of things. Clear, new way that we're moving towards addressing some of these issues is also strengthening institutions. Yeah. Can you say a little bit about the security sector?
So, and in order for law enforcement agencies, security agencies, to be able to discharge their constitutional mandate, their responsibility as stipulated in the law of the land, a lot of effort has been expended to strengthen these institutions, to make them more inclusive, to make them more modern and equipped to withstand the challenge of the 21st century. So because we have strengthened these institutions, today the state stands. Had it not been for the reform effort in strengthening these institutions, in enhancing their capability, given the challenge we have faced, the Ethiopian state could have collapsed. But because a lot of effort there has been a lot of reform programs that have been implemented in these institutions due to the heroism and patriotism of men and women in these institutions, and due to their enhanced capability as well. Despite the multiple and overlapping challenges the Ethiopian state has faced, we have been able to resist this challenge, and we have overcome many of these challenge. There have been several efforts at the regional level or at a zonal level or at a federal level, attempts to get rid of this administration and install a new administrator, a new political group using violence, using force, and we have been able to foil these efforts using our law enforcement agencies by enforcing the law of the land. This has been a critical component, not the only response, but one of the most critical and important initial responses. But there has always been a realization that law enforcement measures, trying to contain the violence, exercising and asserting the monopoly of violence that the state is legitimately entitled to, that doesn't give us the entire solution. We have tried to assert the monopoly that the government is entitled to over the coercive instruments of the state. We have insisted upon that principle, but we know that that's just half the equation. It doesn't really resolve the deeply rooted challenge and problems that I have alluded to earlier. So there has always been this openness to talk, to negotiate, to have dialogue.
And there's been several instances and attempts as well.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit more on those?
Many of those efforts have also been successful. So, for example, in the Benishangul Gumuz regional state, there are several armed actors, militant groups that were involved in conflict. The same has occurred in the Amara, Oromia, and Tigray regional states. There have also been pockets of instability in other regions of the country as well. And while upholding law, the law of the land, while trying to enforce the law using law enforcement agencies, using legitimate force, the government had also engaged with these actors, and there have been peace agreements, understandings with these groups, and in Benishangul Gumuz, recently in the Oromia regional state.
The faction of the Oromo Liberation Army as well.
And most notably in the northern part of the country with the TPLF. There have also been certain elements in the Amara regional state where regional governments or the federal government or even zonal administrators have concluded agreements with militant groups so that those who have raised up arms could return to normal civilian life. And there is a give and take here. The government provides them amnesty, an opportunity to engage in civil, democratic, political life.
Let's get into that detail because it leads me to one of the other questions, which is related to sustainably, closing this historical chapter of a cycle of violence. We have inherited a lot of historical baggage that has not been addressed through, decades and decades. And now we find ourselves at an opportune time when there's various processes that have been initiated by the government. Can you indicate what are some of these processes and initiatives that have been commenced over the past few years that are inevitably going to lead to sustainable peace?
I think in this regard, there are three processes that are very important and that are notable. Say the DDR process, a process for the disarmament, demobilization, and most importantly, the reintegration of those who have raised up arms. It's the intention of the government is not just to fight with militants, to vanquish them and get rid of our compatriots, our brothers and sisters. There is a preparedness, a willingness, an openness for them to, and an institutionalized mechanism for them to be reintegrated into civilian life. There are programs for their rehabilitation, their economic and social rehabilitation, and to provide them with some form of livelihood, to ensure that they would have a platform and an opportunity to engage in the political life of the country. So there is...
You yourself were recently in the Tigray region at a program marking the launch or some aspect of the DDR program. And there have been reports also of some armed actors within the Tigray region who have gone through this process as well. Maybe you could also tie it to that experience.
So one thing that the government has done immediately after the Pretoria Agreement was inked was to establish a DDR commission. In Amharic, it has been named Tahaddiso Commission. And this commission, in partnership with partner countries, donors, has first and foremost tried to design a comprehensive, context-sensitive DDR program by learning lessons from the best practices of other countries, but by taking into account our national context. After designing the roadmap, the program, we have engaged in an intensive resource mobilization effort because it's a resource-intensive program. So once that has been put in place, and in this process, the former, our former antagonists are part and parcel of the process. It's not something that the federal government does by itself. It's not. So it's something that is indicated in our agreement as well. So in the leadership, in the board, in the management as well, we try to be inclusive. We try to ensure that those who could, in one way or the other, represent ex-combatants are included. So once the program has been designed and resources have been secured, in the initial phase, the plan is to have a DDR program that will accommodate 75,000 ex-combatants. So that's what we launched a few weeks ago. So once that is completed, another cohort, another batch will go through the same process. And the DDR Commission and program would also work in other regions as well, depending on the need and availability of resources. So that's one of the initiatives that we are trying to implement.
The second one is something that had been commenced during your tenure as Minister of Justice.
Yeah, and that is a transitional justice process. What we have to realize is, there are many grievances, allegations, narratives, and realities of abuse, violations, and injustice in our history that have come, that have been, these are wounds that go back generations. And unless we heal these wounds, unless we address them, unless we have clear, open, honest, candid conversation about these issues, not to relitigate them, but to heal them, to have a common understanding of what has happened, what are the lessons we should draw from what has transpired, what is true, what is not true, who has done what, and on the basis of the truth, unless we facilitate reconciliation, accountability, and reform our institutions, so long as these wounds are open, so long as they are not addressed, they will fester and will always be in trouble. So the objective of the transitional justice process, it's not just limited to the recent conflict, but it's more comprehensive. And the intention of this process is to ensure that we ascertain the truth, we have an accurate, agreed upon record of what has happened, so that we draw lessons from what has happened, and so that we have reconciliation and some form of accountability. And through this process, close the file on past grievances and injustice. It doesn't mean that we'll forget what has happened, but there will be forgiveness, and we'll be in a position to move forward. You see this fixation and obsession
on past grievances
in our politics.
But the most interesting thing is as well, because there's one of the criticisms that I hear often from external actors with the transitional justice process is that it's not fixed to a certain short time period, that it goes beyond that. But I think in its defense, I believe that part of one of the things that you said is it's supposed to be a healing process. So enabling those that have held these past grievances to have a mechanism and an institution where they could relay these grievances is also part of the healing process. What would you say to that criticism that it's not time-bound?
I would say that it is time-bound to some extent. As far as criminal prosecution is concerned, criminal accountability is concerned, there is a threshold. There is a time period within which the institutions will have to focus.
Not to the recent conflict only.
Not just recent conflict, but it goes back to the time where we adopted a normative framework saying that, okay, from now on you can't torture anyone. From now on you can't engage in extrajudicial killing. So once we have adopted those normative frameworks within our constitutions, anyone who has engaged in those processes in a systematic manner, in a systematic and gross violation of those principles, should be held accountable. But to say that, okay, we'll focus on the last 4 years or 5 years or 10 years only, if we don't afford an opportunity for everyone who has a grievance to come to the front and recount what has happened, tell their truths, and have an opportunity to air out their grievances. And for us as a nation to address those issues, it will become arbitrary. It will not be inclusive. Some people will say, okay, so-and-so's grievance is more privileged than mine. I'm not getting an opportunity to have my voice heard. So what we have said in the policy framework is for truth and reconciliation purposes, so long as there are evidences, so long as there are witnesses, so long as there are people who consider themselves to be victims, we should be open to have that conversation. If there is someone with that kind of grievance, they should have a hearing, they should have an opportunity to be heard. The process itself could be therapeutic. The purpose is not for someone to come and say, oh, so-and-so did this, so I want to have some form of vengeance. It is for most of the victims having an opportunity to be heard, to be recognized, to be validated in a public forum. That could be part of the healing. And I think instead of passing to the next generation a litany of grievances, and instead of having the next generation trapped in this vicious cycle of vengeance and vindictive political cycle,
it offers one pathway.
Yeah, it will help us close the file, close the chapter on this part of our history, and engage in a dialogue about our future. What kind of state do we want? What should be our leading principles? How do we understand?
And that's a good segue, because cleaning what has transpired before and then opening up a new chapter, that is essentially what the national dialogue is offering as well. You had talked about earlier about historical narratives, contesting historical narratives, a multiplicity of agendas that are being put forth by various political actors. And one other process that has come into play by the government is the national dialogue. So maybe you can segue off from that and elaborate.
Thank you. So there are contradicting and clashing visions of what the Ethiopian state should look like, what it should be about, what should be its symbols, how should it be arranged, how should it be configured. On basic foundational issues, we have deep-seated differences, and there is contestation about these issues. And whenever we have this political engagement or
sometimes not a making of this generation as well.
Yes, these
just
are
inherited hearsay, and adding on to our own interpretation of what it should be.
So our interpretation of our history is quite divergent. Our understanding of where we are today and where we want to go to, there are huge differences about this.
And prior
issues.
Political actors have also actually played on those differences and cleavages to maintain power, as you've said before.
Yeah, and it is difficult to have civil discourse and politics while you have these kind of differences. When you don't have a common denominator, when we don't agree on what makes us Ethiopian, what is the Ethiopian state, and what are the procedures and mechanisms through which our political differences should be resolved. We don't even agree on the rules of the game. Some of us are trying
at
to
the political elite level.
Yeah. So the political elite is someone might be trying to play soccer, someone else is trying to play volleyball, but we are in the same field. Mm-hmm. So what I consider to be a foul for you is a legitimate play. So these are things that we need to address. And, as a government, what we didn't want to do is impose, as a ruling party and a government, we didn't want to impose our vision, our solutions, to come and say that, okay, this is the problem that we have identified, and this is the solution, this is our prescription, accept it and live with it. That is what successive regimes have done.
The prescriptive aspect.
Yeah, and it has always failed. The imperial government has came up with its own vision, with its own understanding, and imposed it through its own constitution. The Derg had also come up with its own prescription and imposed it through its own constitution. EPRDF has done the same. So, this pattern where a new government comes, then it writes a new constitution by itself, it has not really helped the situation. In fact, it has made it worse.
Changes a flag.
Yeah.
Changes a national anthem.
Root and branch, you change everything. That leads to more confusion. That adds to our polarization. Some people will like the new dispensation. Some people will say, oh, the previous arrangement was better. And it also makes it difficult for our institutional arrangements, for our constitutional arrangements to settle in and take root. So instead of focusing on economic issues, on how we should create more jobs, how we could bring about more investment or economic growth, our contestation will be about these big issues, these constitutional issues. So what we have determined, what we have resolved to do is, instead of imposing our solution, what we should put in place is a process that will be inclusive, that will be open, so that everyone will come up with their own understanding and diagnosis of the problem. And collectively, as a nation, together, we could search for solutions through a deliberative process, through a through a dialogue, by trying to persuade and convince one another, come up with certain basic principles, certain solutions that could serve as a common denominator, that could serve as our agreed upon social contract, the terms and conditions for our coexistence. We need to agree upon those for us to move forward. So the National Dialogue Process, the National Dialogue Commission has been established with this objective in mind. So if you look at the proclamation establishing the National Dialogue Commission, it doesn't prescribe or stipulate the agenda for dialogue. It leaves it open for the public at large to
articulate
what they want to be agenda items in the deliberative process. And we believe that in the long run, in terms of renewing and revitalizing our social contract, this would be a very important and historic process.
There are a lot of criticisms in terms of the process itself. But I mean, we need to be able to address how it is an Ethiopian process that is addressing an Ethiopian problem. It cannot be an institution, or it cannot be a process that is a copy and paste of other processes elsewhere. And sometimes I feel like the way that this process is perceived is through the lens of other country experiences, but we are in a unique political context, a unique historical processes that have brought us to this sense as well. How would you react to some of the skeptics around the national dialogue as well as the other processes as well?
I would say that some of the skepticism, as you have said, might emanate from trying to measure these processes in light of the practices or experiences of other countries. There is an element of that, but I would say that if you measure these processes as they have unfolded so far in light of any international best practice and standard, I would say they would stand up to scrutiny. And they have been for example, the national dialogue process, the way agenda items have been selected, the way participants are being selected, it has been very, very inclusive. It has been very open, and it has enabled grassroots participation, ordinary citizens to participate in the process. In fact, some of the criticism, in my view, is triggered by the fact that it has been very inclusive, because the political class, some political parties and actors are of the opinion that they have a monopoly over the solution. They don't see the sense of having ordinary people participate in the process. They say what we need is elite bargain. So we'll have, the big men and women, most of the time men, who have hated political parties for decades. They think that the solution would come if a few of them, the wise few, the powerful few, get into a room, hash it out amongst themselves, arrive at some elite pact. You get that office, I'll get this. This will be my sphere of influence, that will be your sphere of influence. And then if we are happy, then because we are the troublemakers, if we behave, things would settle down. They have that kind of opinion.
But I mean, more than half of the Ethiopian population is under the age of how?
Exactly. And they want us to have this deliberation, this discussion on agenda items that have been framed and stipulated 50 years ago. But the reality has changed. There is a new generation that is entitled to have its own voice, that is that has its own views, that has its own priorities. I understand that there is room and utility for a degree of elite bargain, but primarily we should have a very democratic, a very inclusive, participatory process in which there is grassroots participation. It should be bottom-up. That is the approach that we have adopted. And from a viewpoint of privilege and from the position of the political elite, this might not always be appealing, but for the long-term success of the process, this is very important.
So my last question to you personally is, what are you hopeful with the new trajectory that Ethiopia is on? What are you most hopeful about?
I believe that we are in an era where things are being built, both literally, physically, and ideationally, ideologically, in terms of narrative and our political sphere, our political institutions. My hope, what I hope to see, what I desire to see, and going forward, I hope that through the national dialogue process, through the transitional justice process, and also through DDR process, a new generation of Ethiopians who have reached a degree of consensus on what being Ethiopian means, what kind of Ethiopia we want to see, state institutions that are very capable, that have a robust legitimacy, a social contract that will last us for the next 200 years. I hope that we are in the process of building these things. So an Ethiopia where everyone is included, where there is equality, solidarity, and freedom, and economic opportunities for people to have gainful employment, to lead a life of dignity, both in the political sphere, in terms of the freedom and liberties they have, and also in the economic sphere, in terms of the livelihood that they have. So a generation that could hold its head up high and say that what we inherited might not be so great. There were challenges, there were many liabilities that we have inherited, but we have passed on the country, the nation, in a more solid footing than we have found it. So that's what I hope to see.
Thank you. We're a few weeks away from ringing the bell. How excited are you about that?
We're very, very excited to ring the bell. We'll officially launch the exchange and the trading platform. Because we're coming near to the launch of the exchange, the interest from the public, the interest from the potential issuers, the interest from potential intermediaries have significantly increased, especially after the IPO of Ethio Telecom. This interest it has shown the commitment of the government, because Ethio Telecom is a state-owned enterprise. They have issued their shares for local investors, retail investors. It shows a lot of commitment from the government side and the issuer side. So from that point on, the interest from local and international participants have significantly increased. So even in the coming weeks, we hope to license a few more participants in the market. But we're very excited for the launch of the exchange.